Well, hello and welcome to Insight with Political Tours, the travel company led by reporters around the world. It's a question posed almost tongue-in-cheek. Can Europe's largest economy really be its sickest? It's a headline that resurfaces every now and then, as far back as the early 1990s. But here's the truth of it. Germany faces some major challenges, and that has consequences for the rest of Europe. We have with us the wonderful Derek Scally, Berlin correspondent for the Irish Times. Hello and welcome, Derek.
Hello there, Nicholas. Hello to you all.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much for being with us. The grounds for the current headline are the state of the German economy, which stagnated in the 3 months to June after shrinking in the previous two quarters, underperforming all of its rivals. And in the background, you have the war in Ukraine, a huge drop-off in trade with China. And we're going to talk about all of that, and then the current political situation and the economy overall. But just to start with, can we go back to a rosier period, Derek, back to the Merkel years, and I guess to talk about Ostpolitik. What did that entail, and why was it so good for Germany's economy?
Yes, we've had several waves of Ostpolitik. I mean, the idea of Ostpolitik came around in the 1970s with Willy Brandt, and we need to get closer. If this is the new world, we need to deal with it. And after unification, when Gerhard Schröder came along, it was very much the idea of we're going to get closer to Russia, trade and transformation. And what Angela Merkel inherited was that idea that if you're doing business with somebody, you're unlikely to go to war with them. And that was very much the thinking behind the energy policy, which of course has fallen on Germany's feet in the last couple of months. The idea was that you could bring Russia into the fold, into the Western European fold, strategically from a security perspective and from an economic perspective, and you could make lots of money along the way. And Germany was front and center there. The German-Russian economic links are huge, and if you looked at the Rolodex in the Kremlin, you'd see an awful lot of German manager names. And so the idea was that, for historical, emotional, but economic reasons, it made sense for Germany to be right in there. And Ostpolitik was very much defined by that. The economic necessity or the economic advantages of a closer Russia as a trading partner really was at the core of Ostpolitik. German foreign policy, they like to dress it up and make it sound to be something noble. It's about German business interests, and the German business interests dictated the German Ostpolitik. And German business interests determined, German energy policy, I would say. And that's that all worked perfectly well. And then Merkel was barely out of office. And some people would say the timing is crucial. She was barely out of office and Vladimir Putin launches his attack. Whether or not the two are connected, I'm not going to say. I don't know. But suddenly that whole Ostpolitik, that whole last 30 years has collapsed. And the trauma in Germany that this was possible, the idea that they might have been fooling themselves to make money, still hasn't really been fully addressed, still hasn't fully been talked about because too many people look bad.
Yeah. We're going to talk about the economy in a bit and how that's been faring and come back to what I was talking about a bit earlier. But just in terms of, let's talk about a couple of things. Firstly, there's the war and what the initial reaction to the war was. But I mean, while we're talking about oil, let's talk about that. Sorry, and gas prices rather. Does anyone know why that gas line blew up in the Baltic or the North Sea? Was it? Can't remember. It was in the Baltic Sea, wasn't it? Yeah.
Well, if I was a cynic, which I'm not, I would say it was blown up because it shouldn't have been there in the first place. There's nobody in Berlin who's ever given me an answer to the question, why are you building pipelines under the Baltic Sea and sidelining Ukraine and Poland, countries to whom you claim you have an eternal moral obligation to not go behind their back. And now you've gone behind their back with not one, but two pipelines. Nobody in Berlin has ever explained that to me. You could say, to build one pipeline is, bad luck. To build two seems careless. And Merkel signed off on the first and on the second. The first she was obliged to because Schröder did it in his last days as Chancellor. The second pipeline, she and everyone in Germany thought this is a fantastic idea. And I've gone to several government press conferences and I said, why is this in Germany's European energy interests? It's in Germany's national go-it-alone interests. And they did that. Every article I've read this week about what they think happened a year ago when the pipelines were blown up, that it was some sort of a Ukrainian operation, deep cover, but the trails all seem to lead to Ukraine. And And they were the most vocal in their protests about these pipelines being built because the original overland pipeline went through their country. They would lose out on a lot of transit fees and so on. But it seems to be that was the case. But I think everyone agrees that it's been done too well, that there'll never be absolute clarity over who was responsible.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll come back to Ukraine in just a bit, but I think the other key component, and I mentioned it, is China. What's happened to trade with China? I know we're here to talk about Germany, but there's been really a significant change in trade with China.
Yes, I mean the fear with China was that Germany is becoming increasingly dependent on China, in particular its auto industry and its chemicals industry. They're continuing to build up the dependencies on China. And so the dogs in the street were saying, will China be Germany's next Russia? And people I talk to, I say, look, we are well aware of our dependencies that we created in Russia, or the dependencies we allowed ourselves to be pushed into by big industry. But Germany has a new China strategy, and the foreign minister, Annalena Baerbock, she said, we will have to be very careful. And she said, we can't afford to do a second time what we did with Russia and spend 200 billion in compensation to try and get these companies out, trying to get them compensated. So there's an idea that, yes, we did get overly dependent on Russia. We're not going to do it again on China. I was actually looking at some of the numbers, and Germany's trade to China is dropping. It's now no longer... I think it was 6%, and it's actually dropping. So the idea that Germany is here's the figures.
6% of German exports.
6% of German. So it was in 2020, it was almost 8%, and now it's last year it dropped to 6.8%. So the idea that Germany's as percentage of its total exports,
but in terms of percentage of overall chain, that's a pretty significant drop, isn't it? From
it's a significant drop, and you could say Germany's auto industry and chemicals industries are strategic. So the dependencies there are definitely rising. I have a good friend, highly well placed in Mercedes, and I said, why are you just creating this huge dependency on China? You're getting drunk on this sort of Chinese income. That could disappear any moment. And she said, what is the alternative to not be operating in a growth market like China? So they say there's a dilemma. Either we do, or we sit on our high horse at home and watch other companies go in, or we get in there, but hopefully not get too dependent. And they said, to be honest, Germany or China is making its own cars. They don't need us anymore. You'll never hear that in the Mercedes press release, but that's what they're saying behind the scenes. So even the German car industry has no illusions about its long-term future. If China continues as it's doing, we will be buying cars from China, not the other way around.
I don't think there are any expectation that China's economy is going to go through another huge growth spurt as it did in the last 15 years or so. So it's no repetition of those, no potential for those kind of statistics again. So let's come back to Ukraine. How did and we're just sort of painting the broader context of what's going on at the moment. Just remind us. I know that initially most countries were saying, okay, we don't know how the war in Ukraine is going to go. The primary concern is not creating World War III with Russia. But Germany moved on that in terms of how it's reacted to the war and also was ready to supply Ukraine with weapons.
Yes, I mean, Germany gets a lot of bad press, and Germany is a very slow country. I always say it's a bit like a big Mercedes. At the traffic lights, the smaller car will zip off in front, but slowly but surely the German Mercedes eventually catches up and will continue going longer. And I think that model applies for its interaction with Ukraine. Immediately after the invasion, Olaf Scholz stood up in Parliament and he announced this Zeitenwende, this watershed. Germany is going to spend, the situation has changed. Security in Europe is changed forever. We have to change with it. And he said, our military isn't up to scratch. We're going to spend 100 billion in a special fund, balance sheet fund, and we're going to increase our defense budget to 60 billion. So this is huge. And on top of all that, they agreed to supply weapons of war to Ukraine, which is something Germany has never done in the post-war period. To date, I was looking at the latest numbers. They've supplied Ukraine with equipment worth nearly 4 billion. So we're talking about tanks, munitions, air defense systems, anti-mine equipment. After the UK and the US, it is the largest supplier in absolute terms. to Poland and the Baltics are supplying huge amounts based on their own relative size. But in terms of actual kit, Germany is up there. There were some,
just to take you up on that, and I suppose the surprising thing is that it's less than the UK's contribution.
Yeah, and I mean, this month Germany's economy is technically in recession, but in the most recent federal budget, defence was the only portfolio not to face cuts. Now, they're still not quite where they should be in terms of NATO 2% of GDP, but Scholz has promised by the end of this term, so they're halfway through their 4-year term, that will be the case. This all sounds fine, but in Germany, this is warp speed. In the Merkel era, everyone has very fond memories of Angela Merkel, but she really just scraped and dredged German military budgets. There was not much left there, and Scholz has to overnight turn that all around. They're joining a very busy queue for new tanks and new planes, so this isn't going to change overnight. But they're working
I know that prompts another question, which is the larger debate about Germany's need to invest in defence and security. I mean, really, the war has really exposed Germany's vulnerabilities when it comes to both the state of it, well, not just arms spending, but the actual ability of it to deal with a conflict or a war.
Yeah, I mean, there's huge complacency in Germany. The idea is it's very easy to be a pacifist in Germany. You just point to Hitler and say, we don't have to do anything. That's a bit flippant, but that's kind of at the end of the debate, we couldn't bear to. But it's about Germany growing up, isn't it? And in the last years, there's sort of lots of strategic talk. Right now, there's an actual war on its doorstep. I could get on a train in Berlin and take the train this day to the front in Ukraine. So it's emotionally closer. So we're seeing a real Germany going from a truculent teenager phase to a sort of a more mature adult phase. That, well, what are we doing for our own defense? And then there's the emotional component, which is easy for us to discount not being German. But the idea of German troops being in other European countries, being invited as part of NATO troops, it's very hard to accept that invitation when emotionally what Germany did the last time they visited these countries. And now we have 35,000 German troops on the ground in Vilnius. It's extraordinary from an emotional, not forget the strategic, but just the emotional leap that requires, and to bring the German public with you. I think it's quite a remarkable shift, and it's happening at warp speed, as I said. The German defense minister
what's the government's messaging on that? How has the government handled it? I mean, from those initial, I mean, Scholz did seem ambiguous. There wasn't a lot of clarity in the first, year, I would say.
Yeah, there wasn't there was clarity in what he wanted, but trying to get Germans to want it too, that's the challenge. And I think what they're doing very slowly is they will never be the first to rush in with whatever the next level of deliveries to the Ukraine is. At the moment, it's planes or a new level of tanks. Germany will never be the first to rush in there, but it will always be right behind, because it doesn't want to be seen to be, Germany the warmonger, and it doesn't want to. It's happy to let other people test the ground and see how Putin reacts to the latest category of arms deliveries. And everyone I talk to here, they all say the same thing, that we'll never be the first, but we won't be the last, but we will be sustainable. Don't forget, Germany has a huge arms industry, so it's actually able to manufacture this stuff. It's not just buying it in on Amazon or whatever the defense equivalent is. They can actually make the stuff here. They're getting, just this week, Switzerland has agreed to send back German tanks to Germany. They will be then refurbished and sent over to Ukraine. So there's a huge amount happening in the background. And I think Germany is quite happy if it gets the reputation of being a bit reticent, while quietly actually doing quite a lot.
Okay. There was a recent paper that came out from Deutsche Bank's research department by a guy called Stefan Schneider, and he went through some of the issues that we were talking about as a sort of the key challenges to Germany and the German economy. The end of cheap gas, the decline of trade with China, Germany's need to invest in defense and security, then climate change, an aging population and a shrinking labor market, he also said, and excessive regulation and bureaucracy. So a lot of things to deal with. What is the give us a sort of political summary? What does the government see as its main challenges, and is it in any way under threat? We're 2 years into the current government, aren't we?
Yeah, well, I'll start with gas, because it actually moves then into the climate question. I mean, there's sort of a narrative going around, which it fits lovely and everyone loves it, and it is that Germany got drunk in the Merkel years on cheap gas, which it used to manufacture stuff that it sold to China. As we've discussed, Germany's exports to China are 6% of its total. And it's true, it was quite dependent on Russian gas. The EU dependency on Russian gas on average was 40%, just before the war began. Germany was at 49%, so almost half of its gas was coming from Russia. Italy, you never hear about Italy. 46% of Italy's gas was coming from Russia. Poland, 40% of its gas. But Finland, Latvia, 90 to 100%, depending on how you measure it. So the idea that Germany was alone in being drunk on Russian gas. In the last year of normal trade, Germany imported 8.3 billion of Russian gas. The Netherlands imported 6 billion worth of Russian gas. The Netherlands is far smaller than Germany, so it was importing an awful lot of gas. A lot of these pipelines, including the undersea pipelines that were blown up, were also continuing on to the Netherlands. So it's true, Germany was the top of its class, but I don't think it was an outlier. It wasn't entirely on its own. And from Merkel, if I was to defend Merkel for a moment, she always said, and she did say quite publicly, I don't believe in gas long term, but if we're going to close down our nuclear plants, which they did after Fukushima, and it's completed this year, we need something to fill the gap. So they always said, for us, gas is transitory, it's a bridging energy source. And you could say, yeah, but while it's a bridging energy source, you're extremely vulnerable. And they were, and that's the vulnerability that Vladimir Putin attacked. But what I would say is remarkable pivot because of the war. I would say Germany has dropped all its Russian gas. It's importing, set up LNG terminals in record time, liquefied gas. And gas is now just 13% of its energy mix. Wind and solar provide nearly twice that. So Germany has been doing this energy transition, mostly with an eye on nuclear power, but it's getting away from gas in record speed. So it's been a bit of a kick up the backside to do this. And just in energy terms, gas for the renewables last year, Germany's renewable sector produced 131 gigawatts of energy, which is 4 times the energy produced by gas. So yes, it was vulnerable. Yes, it was blind, I think. But many people in Germany, not just Merkel, were blind. Nobody's ever answered why were they all so blind to the dependency and the vulnerability. But if we want to, we could cry over spilled milk or lost gas.
But there's been a quick transition.
There's been a quick transition. And again, Germany's a large country. To be able to do that, nobody froze last winter. And they're now, the pivot towards renewables is remarkable. The pace. And I think Germans never quite see how well they're doing on certain things.
Well, let's come back to that political question. Your scorecard then on this government 2 years into office?
I'd give it a solid C plus B minus, I think, mostly because of one thing. Gerhard Schröder had a very particular leadership style. He banged on the table and say, this is what we're doing. Merkel had a very particular leadership style. She would kind of wait everyone out, see where things are going, and she'd be the first to arrive where everyone else was already heading. And then she could say, hello. And she had a moderating style. She didn't bang on the table. With Scholz 2 years in, nobody quite knows what his leadership style is, which is kind of ironic because in the campaign 2 years ago, he said, if you elect me, if you order me, you're going to get leadership, just so you know. And many people, I can't really think of anyone who can say they know what Olaf Scholz's leadership style is. He has a bit of Merkel sort of holding back, waiting things out, ostriching, I think they used to call it with the Queen Mum and Queen Elizabeth in the UK, ostrich and wait it out. But then he has a bit of the Gerhard Schröder bang on the table. This is what we're going to do, whether it's on green energy for homes or at the moment the migration debate in Europe. He just sort of sits around, waits and waits and waits, and Europe waits and waits and waits, and eventually just bangs on the table and says, "This is what we're doing." But he's done that a couple of times so far, and I'm not sure 2 years in if you're sort of railroading your coalition partners, is that a sign of strength or is that a sign of weakness in terms of leadership?
I want to stick with the sort of political side. Is it October the 8th? There are elections coming up, regional elections in Hesse and Bavaria. Is that right?
Yeah. Yes.
I got the two. Yeah. There was an incident, a bit of a political fallout that happened there affecting the CDU, but that had broader ramifications. Tell us a bit about it.
Are you talking about Bavaria?
I'm talking about the comic book scandal. Well, it's not.
Oh, yes, with Aiwanger. Yeah. Well, Bavaria is the CSU. This is the sister party of the CDU. So the CDU is Merkel's party, and the CSU, the Christian Social Union, is only operating in Bavaria. They've been in power since the end of the Second World War. They have a junior coalition partner called the Free Voters, and their leader, apparently back in the day, I think in the 70s or something, was distributing a pamphlet with terrible anti-Semitic tropes and stereotypes and nastiness, which his brother apparently drafted. And this has all come out now during the election campaign. So many people have been unimpressed by this. You don't make jokes as anti-Semitic jokes, or you own up to them very quickly. And Hubert Aiwanger is the guy's name. He spent days just flailing around. You don't, in terms of crisis communication, you act quickly. Any crisis, you have to have a clear line and act quickly. He didn't have a clear line, and he didn't act quickly. So we'll see what that affects. But the Bavarian election, it's very interesting. We've got the far right Alternative for Deutschland nibbling away. Both of these parties, the Free Voters and the Christian Social Union, the sister party to the CDU, they're both on the right. They're on the harder end of the right spectrum. But you've still got this AfD with nearly 20% in Bavaria nibbling away. And pulling everything over to a more populist side. So I'm actually working on a piece at the moment at just how populist Bavarian politics has become, and whether that will then spread to the rest of the country. It's unique circumstances in Bavaria, but it's perhaps an interesting sign of things to come in German politics, where the AfD is really shifting or really forcing politicians and debates to move closer to them, further to the right than perhaps in the past. The migration crisis is a classic example. Suddenly we're hearing things from mainstream politicians that you would more likely to hear from the AfD or from Austria and so on. So things are moving fast, things are changing fast in German politics.
Right. Okay. Well, we'll come back to migration in just a second. Please, if anyone's got questions, just do hit the raise your hand button or put your question in the Q&A box, and then you can put your question directly to Derek. So it's just summing things up. For the moment, no real major political opposition to the government. They've managed to deal with the war relatively successfely. It's a sort of an image of stability. What's going on within Europe? Germany is the key power within Europe, and the war in Ukraine has posed the European Union with major problems. There's the question of EU candidacy for Ukraine, which is an enormous idea, as well as Moldova. And then there's the Western Balkans. What is this is a major consideration for the European Union. How does it deal with it, and what's Germany's position on it?
Oh, Germany in this position is very, very middle of the road. It's been consistent in saying, yes, we need to offer you a perspective. Olaf Scholz has been visiting Southeastern Europe and trying to say that. On Ukraine, obviously, it's very difficult. It's also the debate about NATO. What are we getting ourselves into? Most people I speak to in Berlin, they always say, look, Ukraine has made tremendous leaps, tragically, a bit like Germany's energy. Politically, the war has led to tremendous leaps in terms of tackling public corruption. You can see Zelensky absolutely taking out people that he believes are involved in war profiteering or so on. But they still say we're not quite sure Ukraine is where we need it to be, both in EU terms and in Ukraine terms. So I think they've got enough to be dealing with in Germany. That's their attitude. And this is just another thing they don't need at the moment.
But what, in terms of, I think there's a question about if you're going to expand again, what kind of internal reforms you have in the EU. I mean, if we think about Hungary, Hungary has been able to break democratic norms without any punishment. There's a question of whether, if you allow another more members to come in, are they going to have the same to act potentially like Hungary? That's one question. So there's the extension of majority voting in areas of policy where you're afraid of a country having a veto on things. So it's easier to get things done by having a majority voting systems in key areas where you don't want someone like Hungary to veto it all the time.
Yeah, so I'm more, yes, sorry, go on.
So what are I mean, these are, they sounds quite technical, but these are important issues. And at the same time, you can't let, in terms of the pace, if you look at what's happening in the Balkans, we can have a talk on the Balkans in October, there is, a huge political turmoil. And one could argue quite easily, it's the failure of the EU to have a clear avenue towards EU membership in that region that has caused those political problems. So how do you balance the two? The need for internal EU reform, dealing with those sort of technical things, how do you deal with new members, as well as making enlargement realistic in terms of its timetable? What's your take on the German government's view?
Well, I think they're very much like a lot of other European countries. They're waiting for the elections in Poland, which will be the middle of October. Poland, like Hungary, well, it's been following the Hungarian model of basically moving towards I won't say a totalitarian state, but definitely an authoritarian state where traditional old-fashioned principles like the rule of law and so on, which are embedded in European treaties and are key to European Union membership, are somehow being seen as open to interpretation, public media, the courts, and so on. And Germany has actually been quite strident on. I won't say strident, but more volume on Poland than I would have expected. So it'll be interesting. I think after the Polish elections out of the way, the European Commission can then act a bit more robustly on EU emergency funding, COVID funding, which it's been withholding from Poland until it makes changes to its justice reforms and other things. Long story, but I think, until these issues are solved, unless you make clear to certain countries that, no, you can't get away with everything as a member of the EU, I don't think you can then, I'm speaking as a sort of a German functionary now, you cannot really, until these issues are clarified, how do you then expand? What I would also say is that countries like when the EU, the last expansion wave in the mid-2000s, the first decade, nobody had Poland and Hungary on its radar. They were all worried about Romania and Bulgaria in terms of corruption and so on. And Poland was considered, front and center, one of the hopes, the great hopefuls of the new branch. So it's rather depressing to see that it's turned into such a problem basket case. And we'll see. I'm covering the Polish election, so it'll be interesting to see how quickly the European Commission get back on track with hassling Poland. There's been a huge issue about selling visas, Schengen visas. Polish officials apparently selling Schengen visas for quite a lot of money to people from India and where have you. Wow. So it's really, really not good. But if PiS, the ruling party in Poland, do win, then Polish voters have voted for more of the same.
Yeah, just as an aside there, I think we should mention the fact that Poland has said it's not going to supply Ukraine with weapons. And this is a bombshell. That's a bad use of expression. But in terms of, Poland has been Ukraine's most prominent supporter, but I presume this is electioneering. But that would worry Germany and any other supporter of Ukraine.
Yeah, we'll see what happens after the election again. The ruling party want to look, we're strong, we're defending the homeland, the motherland, and we can use every bit of equipment we can get. So yeah, there's a bit of electioneering on that and also on the grain issue. But yeah, Germany has actually been quite vocal on the visas issue. Olaf Scholz has provoked all sorts of ire in Warsaw because he said we need to get this sorted, because a Polish official in Mumbai is selling Schengen visas to somebody claiming to be a Bollywood film producer, and they disappear into the Schengen area. And this is happening on a vast scale, apparently. Then that raises serious questions for Poland's place in the Schengen area. And for him to raise that, German politicians know they cannot win by criticizing Poland. But the fact that they have suggests also for me a slight maturing in its relationship with certain countries, including Poland.
I've got plenty more questions, but I'm going to defer to others who've got good questions as well. So we've got a question from Sir Harold Walker, Hookie Walker. Go ahead, Hookie. If you just open your microphone, you can put your question to Derek.
Yes, I wouldn't have asked this question, but that the conversation has widened out into the complexities facing the whole of the EU and Germany's role therein. What is Germany's view at the moment of Turkish aspirations for membership of the EU and indeed for Turkey's relationship with NATO? That's another complication facing the EU and Germany.
Yes, I have to admit, Sarald, I'm not a huge expert on Turkey, but as far as I know, the policy from the Merkel era hasn't changed. that at its heart, Berlin doesn't want Turkey in the EU, but it will continue offering it something else just as good, maybe something like the deal it has with the UK, who knows. But as far as I know, there haven't been any drastic changes there. But obviously on the migration issue, which we might touch on in a few minutes, Turkey has been hugely important. The hopes of, I think Germany shared the hopes of everyone else that they would be dealing with a slightly less authoritarian figure if the election result had been different. The fact that it wasn't means they have to deal with that. But given the Turkish population here in Germany, I think they're always aware. They have sort of I won't say a fifth column, that would sound racist, but they're very well aware of public opinion in Turkey, because many people here are very well plugged into the political and media debates in Turkey.
Derek, let's talk about migration then, as you mentioned there. I mean, it's obviously a very sensitive issue across Europe. Large numbers of arrivals consistently happening. Outline what the European debate is, and then talk about what Germany's position has been and why it might be able to bring about what's happened in the last day or so.
Yeah. And just a very brief snapshot here on the ground. Every week I go for piano lessons in Flughafen Tempelhof, which is Tempelhof Airport, the Nazi-era airport. It's this massive thing, if you've ever seen it. It's about 1.5 kilometers long. This is now home to one of Europe's largest refugee camps. According to German authorities, 204,000 asylum applications from January to August this year. That's up 80% on the same period last year. They're basically saying it's 2015 all over again, but we still haven't quite dealt with the people from 2015. Plus, we've had 1.something million Ukrainians who have arrived. So this idea of a warm German welcome and Angela Merkel's "we can do this" talk, not going to happen this time. So in Tempelhof, where I go week for week, I've been watching the airport fill up, 1.5 kilometers of hangars filling up. And now they've started adding containers outside. One of the world's largest buildings now has containers outside and tents outside. And they're just, I spoke to the guy who's running, and he said, we've never had a concentration like this. We cannot cope. We really cannot cope. But it's the same all over Germany. They're picking up people crossing the border from Poland. Polish authorities seem to be just allowing people walk through. So in one area of eastern Brandenburg, 50 people a day. Again, this is nothing like what's coming through from Italy, but for by German standards, this is remarkable. So that's the snapshot here. The debate is currently today in Brussels is a huge debate on the latest stage of a pan-European migration deal, which would, for once and for all, have a system of common rules and common quotas, where countries will either accept the quota they're supposed to take or make a contribution financially or some other way. And Germany has actually been blocking this. You think of people blocking migration pacts, you think of Austria, or you think of Austria, you think of Hungary, you definitely think of Poland. And actually, Germany's been blocking it for months now, and it seems the blockade has been released. What it was a coalition row here in Berlin. So Scholz's coalition is Social Democrats, the Liberals, Free Democrats, and the Greens. And the Greens were blocking the migration pact because they felt there were certain conditions in there that would lower humanitarian standards and if a country declared a state of emergency. So Scholz banged on the table, showed us style yesterday, and said, we are not going to be the country who holds up the migration pact. We are not going to be in a camp with Poland and Hungary, even if it's for very different, high-minded ideals. So that deadlock seems to have been broken. But the fact that Germany is so unsure on what it wants on the migration issue, I think they're changing. The tone has gotten very tough, as I mentioned before. People are all realizing, the AfD is like 1/3 of voters in some Eastern German states are now backing the AfD, and all the experts that say to it's the migration issue is the issue. And if you don't address it, if you still have sort of a woolly, hand-wringing approach to migration, we need to address hardship in Africa, that won't help mayors who are struggling to find beds for people tonight. So Germany's just going through a debate that many other countries, including the UK and elsewhere, how far do you go? How big, how hard does your heart have to be to help the people who really need your help? And it's a very tough debate for Germany, given its own history and given its own, its reputation as being sort of a heavyweight on the humanitarian front.
Yeah, and another big issue, both within Europe and Germany, is the issue of debt. and this is a key issue in terms of development, economic development. We all know that Germany's attitude towards debt is a reluctant one. They don't want to take on more debt. They much prefer to save. And when it comes to the idea of Europe issuing debt, it's been a big no-no. But there seems to be some kind of change in that. I mean, I should say that the debt brake was inserted into the German constitution in 2009. So you tell me a bit more about their reluctance and then why it's so significant that they may be changing their minds or becoming a bit more flexible about it. And COVID is obviously has had something to do with it.
That's true. Yeah, the German and debt. I mean, the word for debt in Germany is Schuld, and Schuld is also the word for guilt. So, and there's a very strong Lutheran streak here. So the idea of having debt or owing anyone money is just a no-no. And when Angela Merkel was chancellor, she often used the idea of the thrifty Swabian housewife who won't spend more than she takes in with her PIN money. But of course, many economists would just throw their hands in the air and say, a country is not a household. You need to spend, particularly in a downturn, as a state to make sensible spending decisions in infrastructure or what have you. Germany has always been, it's in its own little world economically. It's never really 100% believed in that. It managed to find a lot of debt in the COVID crisis, blew a lot of money to keep things going. But now
the fundamental accusation there is that it's failed to invest in long-term infrastructure.
Precisely. Yeah, I mean, the German rail is nothing as bad as in the UK, but its reputation is in tatters because the German rail company was being forced to pay 250 million a year in dividends to the German government, its owner, rather than investing. But that's another debate. We could talk about that for an hour. But Germany is always there's a huge public support for what they consider sensible, sustainable public finances, which is getting back to this debt brake. It was set aside for 2 years in the pandemic. The debt brake means you cannot raise more than 0.4% of your GDP in debt. You have to balance your budget. And the new Liberal finance minister is determined to do that. But many people are saying, well, we're in recession and we need huge spending in infrastructure. Can you not find a way to sort of do what you did in the COVID or with the defense pact? There's 100 billion. They're kind of putting it outside the balance sheet. But just like that, putting things outside balance sheet is considered a secure road to hell here. So we're back to this very German debate about economics and do you spend in a downturn or do you not?
So that's internal debate, but then there's
that's affecting the European level as well, because obviously in the pandemic, for the first time, Angela Merkel finally agreed to something she never agreed to in the past, which was allow the EU to issue debt, and with that money raised, just blanket the European Union with money, particularly for things like infrastructure spending and so on. And she insisted this is a one-off, but yeah, it's a one-off. Was it a one-off? She's out of the picture now. And Olaf Scholz, former finance minister, so he would have negotiated this for Merkel. He was brought around to the idea that this is a good idea. And as a social democrat, his party is politically more in tune with the idea of the state spending and deficit spending, if need be, than the Christian Democrats. But he's been a bit more cautious since he became chancellor, but he gave one or two indications that he thinks if the EU has a future, it has to move to the next level. And that next level is issuing debt and becoming more of a player in European affairs than just using the money that member states have given to it. The break at the moment is Christian Lindner. As on the national level, so too at the European level, he is blocking the idea of permanent or regular issuing of European debt. But I think they have broken the taboo, and it'll be interesting to see how that debate goes. But at the moment, they're still holding on to old certainties.
Okay. I mean, so far, you've given an impression of Germany as capable of dealing with these issues, muddling through, finding solutions, migrations, one example, and the indication there is that on this tricky issue of debt, there might be a way they'll muddle through too. Who knows? I want to ask the googly, if you like, is what a thing that could happen in a year next January, which is the swearing in to the White House of a second Donald Trump presidency. Are there any noises about that? What are your views? That could put Europe and Germany in a very tricky position.
A very tricky position. I used to like to torment Angela Merkel's old spokesman, Steffen Seibert. I'd say, I'm from Ireland, Stefan. I said, Donald Trump is playing golf in Ireland again. When are you going to invite this great German-American president for an official visit? His German roots have on both sides been kept very quiet.
Trump, isn't it? Trump.
Trumpf. Yeah. His granddad, interestingly enough, not only did Donald Trump get out of serving in the military, his grandfather got out of serving in the military. He fled Prussia, and when he came back to look for a wife, he had to flee again because they realized he was a draft dodger. So it runs in the family, apparently. Trump has no love lost for Germany, and the feeling is mutual. I think everyone is so busy with everything else going on at the moment, they never really found a way of working with Trump. But I think one common, he used to like to rag Germany about its defense spending, but I think Germany will be in a very different space on the defense perspective if and when a second Trump administration comes along. Of course, the question is, will they be able to pick up the slack if the US pulls back on Ukraine? And the answer is no. But at least Germany will be slightly more robust, hopefully on a firmer footing on the defense front.
Yeah, okay. Chaps, without further questions, I'm going to wrap this up. But any more? I mean, I'm just going to say one. The initial question we had was about is Germany the sick man of Europe, and we've concluded that 18 months ago, who would have thought that Germany would have got rid of its reliance on Russian gas so quickly? There's confidence about the Mittelstaat and how the economy can revive itself. So things are not nearly as bad.
I would say the UK coverage of Germany has always been consistently. We
have to remind we've got an international global audience.
Okay, but let's say the Anglosphere. Let's put it down. The Economist. Other news outlets are available, but the Economist has once again done Germany the sick man of Europe. And look back. I would just basically say look back on German. The Economist German headlines over the years. The Economist will put on its cover what will sell. And I think things are serious here. And if I was concerned about one thing, it's just what does Germany actually want, and what does it want to want? What does it feel capable of doing economically, politically, strategically? And I don't see any particular clear answers there. I see a leader who has very strong views of himself. He is a leader, but I don't see him leading. He has a coalition of three parties that have never worked together, and they're struggling to fight. They're fighting with each other and not giving they're not speaking one voice to the electorate. The electorate are really, really not impressed. So it's a bit leaderless at the moment, but the system here has faced challenges before. The AfD is a challenge the far right has never faced before. Things are serious, but I think they're serious everywhere.
Let's just give it. So the threats are obviously. I would say Trump in the US presidency,
which they can do nothing about.
Backing out of Ukraine, and where does Europe go on that? And that's dealing with Russia. Yeah. And migration as the next thing. If you've got migrants still flowing into large numbers into European cities, that's going to be a fuel populism and the AfD.
Yeah, and also climate transformation. Like Germany was desperately hoping to not have a war in Ukraine, so it could focus on. It wanted to be a sort of a climate industry superpower, that it would make the machines for the new climate revolution. This is also not. It's using all of its capacity to try and get away from Russian gas and fossil fuels. So yeah, this government started up with great intentions, and I would say it has struggled to actually get away from what it wanted to do to what is actually happening. But there are still, given Germany's size and scale, it is remarkable some of the things they've managed. But yeah, I don't really see many new positive developments in German domestic politics looming. The momentum is definitely slowing down. So the next 2 years will be, if the first 2 years were challenging for a new government with a war in Europe, the next 2 years are going to be fairly dire, I'm afraid.
Okay, now I am going to be UK-centric in my questions now. All the UK parties refuse to mention any idea of rejoining the single market or anything approaching EU membership. I guess nobody cares about us, but it seems to me that German auto manufacturers do care about us, because they've been lobbying to ensure that batteries and similar things can be produced in the UK and still exported into Europe. You'll have to summarize that if you know about it.
I don't actually.
Right. Okay.
The German. All I remember about the German auto industry in the UK was in the Brexit debate. There was this hilarious idea going around London and the corridors of power in Whitehall that Germany would come to the rescue of David Cameron and his many successors because the German auto industry couldn't afford to lose the UK market, and nobody in Germany had heard of this, and nobody in the German car industry was able to either lobby there. They never lobbied Merkel, or they didn't care because they're exporting 55% of German exports go to the European Union. Why would you endanger any of that by giving sweetheart deals to one member? So
I think there's been some rustling along those lines. It's about battery manufacturing, but
it's also an emotional need in the UK to realize to think that they haven't been forgotten by Germany. But yeah, who knows? Yeah, batteries will save the day.
Okay. Derek, thank you very much indeed. It's been great. A really good summary and overview of things. Excellent as ever. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. Hello to you all. Take care. Bye-bye.